On a warm spring morning in 1945, a transport truck rattled along the dirt roads leading to an American prison camp in Michigan. The doors of the truck creaked open with a heavy metallic clang, and 3 German prisoners stepped out into the bright sunlight. Their eyes were squinting from the sudden light after months of darkness and confinement. The women, who had been living in constant fear of the unknown, found themselves in a place that felt strange in every sense of the word. The scent of fresh air was unfamiliar and almost overwhelming after the staleness of their previous quarters. Their hearts were heavy, unsure of what to expect from these new surroundings, but one thing was clear: this place was nothing like what they had imagined. As the women stepped onto the hard, cracked earth, they noticed the camp stretching before them, an orderly collection of buildings and wide, well-maintained pathways. There was no barbed wire in sight, no looming guard towers that they had expected to find. Instead, there was a strange silence in the air, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices. The sharp contrast between what they had been told to expect and the reality before them left them stunned and wary. These women had been taught to believe that the Americans were savage creatures who had no respect for life, let alone the lives of prisoners. The myths of brutality had been drilled into their minds, and now they were faced with something they could not comprehend. As they stood there, trying to process the scene, one of the women, Ingrid, took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had been through more than most could imagine: the air raids, the surrender, the forced relocations, and finally, this. The horror stories from the other prisoners haunted her, stories of camps where starvation was common, where death was an everyday occurrence. She had been preparing for the worst, bracing herself for the cold, indifferent cruelty of a military camp. But here, in this place, things were different. The women felt an uneasy sense of disbelief. Was this really an American camp, or was this just a facade to hide something worse? Ingrid, who had once commanded a field hospital, had seen enough of war's cruelty to understand that kindness could be a trap. She whispered to her companions, "Do not trust them. Expect nothing but cruelty." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through the worst and had learned that survival depended on never letting your guard down. The other women nodded, their faces pale, but their eyes filled with uncertainty. None of them knew what to expect from this place, but they all knew that their best chance for survival was to remain vigilant, to not show any signs of weakness. The officers who met them were dressed in clean, crisp uniforms. There was no shouting, no rough handling, just calm, controlled movements. Ingrid watched them closely, her military training telling her to observe every detail, to look for any hint of hostility or malice, but there was none. The captain who greeted them was polite, his voice steady as he offered them a chance to rest. "Welcome to Camp Blackwater," he said, his words clipped but not unkind. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be processed, given food, and assigned quarters." His words should have been reassuring, but Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The women were escorted to a building where they were told to wait while their belongings were searched. As they stood there, Ingrid's mind raced. She thought of her family, of the small photograph she had kept hidden in her coat, the one picture that had survived the chaos of the last few years. She thought of her children, who she hadn't seen in months, and wondered if they were still alive. She couldn't bring herself to hope, not after everything she had been through. Yet, as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to settle in her chest, one she had not felt in a long time. Could it be possible? Could they actually be telling the truth? When the women were finally led to their quarters, they were stunned. The rooms were clean, the beds made with white sheets, and towels folded neatly at the foot of each bed. Hot water was running in the sinks, and a faint, pleasant scent of soap filled the air. Ingrid's hands trembled as she touched the bed, the softness of the sheets feeling like an impossibility. In all her years of service, of suffering, she had never encountered such comfort. Her mind couldn't grasp it. The other women stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. "Is this a trick?" Ingrid muttered to herself. "It must be. Nothing is this kind unless there's something worse to come." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her mind. The images of brutality and suffering that she had been raised on were beginning to crack, and she didn't know if she was ready to face the consequences of that. The small, fleeting hope that began to form inside her made her uneasy. Was it possible that they were actually safe here? Or was this just another form of psychological warfare? The hours stretched into days, and the women settled into their new quarters. They were allowed to wash, eat, and rest. Their days were spent in a strange limbo, with nothing to do but wait for whatever came next. Ingrid observed the camp's routines, carefully noting the differences between the reality of this place and the horrors they had been taught to expect. She began to wonder, was this the beginning of a new chapter, a chance at survival and healing, or was this just the calm before the storm? The fear that clung to her heart made it impossible to believe in the possibility of peace. But even as she wrestled with that fear, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something unexpected. But one thing was certain. Nothing about this camp was what she had imagined, and nothing about this place seemed to fit into the narrative she had been taught. For better or worse, this was their new reality, and they would have to learn to navigate it no matter how impossible it seemed. The days following their arrival at Camp Blackwater were strange and unsettling. Ingrid and the other prisoners had expected to face harsh interrogations, uncomfortable living conditions, and the usual routines of forced labor. But instead, they were assigned to various tasks around the camp. The work was not physically grueling, and the atmosphere was strangely calm. There were no screams, no harsh orders, and no violent punishments. The most shocking difference, however, was what they found in the workshops. On their second day, they were led into a large, open building that resembled a typical workshop. But as they stepped inside, they were struck by the sight of something they had never seen before. Machines, tools, and contraptions powered by electricity. The Germans had long been accustomed to manual labor, using hand tools, makeshift instruments, and rudimentary machinery. But here, in this American workshop, the workers were using power tools that hummed and whirred with an eerie precision. Ingrid, who had spent years working with simple tools in the field, watched in disbelief as an American worker used an electric drill with such ease it seemed like magic. The way the drill effortlessly cut through the wood, the whirring sound of the motor, and the smooth motion of the worker's hands were all so alien to her. She had never imagined that such technology existed, technology that could do the work of 10 men in a fraction of the time. It was as if she had stepped into a different world, one where work could be done without endless struggle. The other prisoners shared Ingrid's amazement, their eyes wide as they looked at the machines. Some of them had worked with basic tools for years, while others had seen nothing but the crudest equipment during their time in labor camps. They couldn't fathom how such machines could exist, let alone be so widely available. Their minds were overwhelmed with the idea that something so efficient, so easy to use, could be in the hands of their captors. In a way, it felt like a cruel joke, an absurd contrast to the suffering they had endured, a glimpse into a world they could never hope to understand. As Ingrid moved closer to a workbench where a soldier was using an electric sander, she couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder mixed with dread. It was all so smooth, so easy, and yet it was so foreign. Her fingers itched to try the tools, to see if she could master them the way the workers had. But there was a nagging thought in the back of her mind. If these tools were so easily available to the Americans, Why had the prisoners been denied even the most basic of comforts for so long? Her curiosity soon turned to frustration as she realized that she and the other prisoners were still being treated as subordinates. Despite the astonishing technological marvels they were witnessing, they were still in captivity, still subject to the whims of the Americans. The fact that these tools existed in the first place only served to highlight the vast divide between their world and the world of their captors. It was as though they were constantly reminded of how much they had lost, how far they had fallen from the life they once knew. Ingrid watched a young American soldier as he effortlessly maneuvered a table saw, his hands steady and sure. The ease with which he worked only made Ingrid feel more alien in her own skin. She had spent years using crude, outdated tools, and now she was seeing these advanced, almost magical machines used with a casual familiarity. It wasn't just the tools themselves that left her stunned. It was the fact that they represented a world she could never be a part of. She would never get the chance to use them, never experience the kind of work that these Americans did every day. The sight of the workers using these power tools filled Ingrid with a strange mixture of awe and resentment. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unfairness. How could the Americans have access to such tools while she and the other prisoners were forced to work with nothing but their hands, their strength, and whatever rudimentary tools they could scrounge? It felt like a cruel reminder of their position in the world, captives, stripped of everything except their labor. But even as she grappled with these feelings, she couldn't help but admire the skill and precision of the workers. They seemed to take such pride in their work, in the machines they used, and in the results they achieved. Ingrid realized that, in a way, these American workers had a kind of freedom that she could only dream of. They could choose their work, choose their tools, and choose how they spent their time. For the prisoners, every moment was dictated by their captors, their work assigned to them, their movements restricted. As Ingrid stood there, watching the electric tools in action, she began to wonder if this strange new world could offer something more than just survival. Could it be possible to adapt, to learn from the Americans, to find some small measure of autonomy in this place? She didn't know, but the thought of it stirred something deep inside her, a flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of a new understanding. Either way, she was beginning to realize that the camp was more complicated than she had first believed, and that the things she had once taken for granted, like the tools of her trade, might not be as out of reach as they had seemed. But as she left the workshop that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true purpose of these machines was not just to make work easier, but to remind them of their place. The Americans had everything, and the prisoners had nothing. And no matter how many electric drills or power saws they saw, they would always be bound by the same chains that had brought them to this place. The days passed slowly in Camp Blackwater, and Ingrid began to notice the stark contrast between what she had expected and what she was experiencing. The camp, with its neatly arranged buildings and well-maintained grounds, seemed almost too perfect, too orderly. It was nothing like the camps she had been in before, where the air was thick with filth and fear, and the food was scarce and rancid. Here there was food in abundance, clean water, and the promise of medical care. It was hard to accept that such conditions could exist in a war zone, especially for someone like her, a prisoner of war. Ingrid had been prepared for the worst, but the reality was so far removed from her expectations that it felt surreal. As she walked through the camp, she saw the other prisoners going about their daily tasks, some working in the garden, others helping in the kitchens or cleaning the barracks. They moved with a sense of purpose, as though the simple act of working had given them back a small piece of their humanity. Ingrid couldn't help but watch them with a mixture of envy and disbelief. She had never imagined that a prison camp could feel so normal. For the first time in months, she felt a strange sense of relief, but at the same time, a gnawing unease began to take root in her chest. It wasn't just the physical comforts of the camp that made her uneasy. It was the way the American soldiers interacted with the prisoners. They were polite, even friendly at times, treating the prisoners with a respect that Ingrid hadn't known was possible. The guards were not the brutal, unfeeling men she had expected. Instead, they were human beings, with names, faces, and even a hint of compassion. Ingrid had spent so long in camps where the guards were nothing but instruments of cruelty that she found it hard to reconcile this new reality with her previous experiences. It felt like a dream, and she feared that when she woke up, everything would revert to the nightmare she knew all too well. Ingrid had heard whispers among the other prisoners that the Americans were trying to create a new kind of camp, one that followed the rules of the Geneva Convention. At first, Ingrid had dismissed these rumors as naive. She had seen promises made before, only for them to be shattered when it mattered most. But as the days went on, Ingrid began to wonder if there was some truth to these rumors. The camp was run with a sense of order that was almost comforting, and the soldiers seemed genuinely interested in the well-being of the prisoners. It was a far cry from the brutal indifference she had grown accustomed to in the other camps. But despite the comforts of the camp, Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The constant surveillance, the rigid routines, the subtle reminders of their captivity, everything felt like a carefully constructed illusion. Ingrid had been trained to be suspicious, to question everything, and she could sense that the Americans were playing a game. They were offering the prisoners small gestures of kindness, but at the same time, they were keeping them under strict control. It was as though they were trying to break the prisoners, not physically, but mentally, by showing them a glimpse of a life they could never have again, and then taking it away. One day, as Ingrid was working in the workshop again, she overheard a conversation between two American soldiers. They were discussing the prisoners, their progress in adjusting to life in the camp, and their rehabilitation. The word struck Ingrid like a blow: rehabilitation. She had been a prisoner for so long she had almost forgotten what it meant to live freely. The idea that the Americans were trying to rehabilitate her and the others was almost laughable. How could they possibly understand what they had been through? How could they comprehend the depths of the trauma they had suffered, the losses they had endured? As the days passed, Ingrid's unease grew. She began to wonder if the Americans were simply playing a long game, using kindness and comfort as a way to manipulate the prisoners into compliance. Perhaps they believed that by offering the prisoners a taste of a better life, they could control them more effectively. Ingrid knew that the Americans had their own motives, and she couldn't help but feel that the kindness they had shown so far was just a tool to extract information, to break their spirits, to make them obedient. Despite these thoughts, Ingrid couldn't ignore the subtle shift in herself. She was beginning to heal, at least physically. The steady meals, the warm baths, and the clean sheets had restored her body in ways that she hadn't thought possible. The pain in her joints, the constant exhaustion, were slowly starting to fade, replaced by a sense of energy she hadn't felt in years. But the emotional scars, the deep wounds caused by years of war and imprisonment, were not so easily healed. Ingrid couldn't let go of the fear that lingered in her heart, that the kindness of the Americans was just another form of control, another way to keep them in line. One evening, as she sat alone in her quarters, Ingrid thought about her family. She had not heard from them since the war began, and the uncertainty of their fate weighed heavily on her. Was her husband still alive? Were her children safe? The thought of them, of the life she had once had, was almost too painful to bear. She longed for the life she had lost, for the simple comforts of home, but at the same time she knew that life could never return. The war had taken too much from her, and now she was stuck in a strange foreign land surrounded by people she didn't trust. And yet, There was something about the Americans, their calm, their politeness, that made her question everything she had ever believed. Could they really be different from the others? Could they truly be trying to help her and the other prisoners to restore some sense of dignity? Or was it all just a game, a way to make them forget their captivity before tightening the noose once again? Ingrid didn't know the answer, but as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was more complicated than she could understand. The morning after Ingrid's unsettling thoughts, she awoke to the quiet hum of the camp. For the first time since arriving, she didn't immediately feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on her. The air outside was cool and crisp, and the sounds of birds chirping filled the otherwise serene atmosphere. It was strange, this quiet. She had grown so accustomed to the sounds of war, the rumbles of distant artillery, the drone of airplanes, the frantic shouting, that the stillness felt almost unnatural. But as the days passed, Ingrid couldn't ignore the growing realization that the comfort here was not entirely without cost. Ingrid's first real interaction with the American soldiers happened shortly after breakfast. She had been assigned to the workshop again, tasked with organizing supplies. As she moved through the large building, sorting through boxes of tools and materials, she noticed something odd. One of the soldiers, a young man named Tommy, had been standing by the workbench, watching her work. His expression was neutral, but there was a certain curiosity in his eyes, as though he was trying to understand who she was, what she had endured. "Need help with that?" he asked casually, his voice warm but guarded. Ingrid hesitated for a moment, not sure how to respond. It wasn't just the question that unsettled her, it was the way he asked it. He wasn't offering help out of obligation. It felt almost genuine. Ingrid had grown so used to the harsh, dismissive orders of the soldiers from her past camps that this simple offer of assistance threw her off balance. She nodded, keeping her response curt, but a part of her felt a flicker of gratitude for the small gesture. Tommy proceeded to help, his movements efficient but careful. As they worked side by side, Ingrid tried to keep her thoughts focused on the task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the same question. Why were these Americans different? Why were they treating her and the others with such courtesy? She had learned long ago that kindness could be a weapon, that every action could serve a hidden purpose. She couldn't afford to believe that the kindness she was receiving was anything but a calculated effort to break her will, to manipulate her into compliance. That night, as Ingrid lay in her cot, the sound of footsteps outside her barracks door echoed in the stillness. She turned over, listening carefully as the guards walked past. They had been so much more relaxed than she expected. No harsh commands, no calls for silence. For the first time since her capture, she felt a sense of unease, not because of fear, but because of the uncertainty that lingered in the air. The night had been so quiet, so calm, but it was too quiet. It was like being lulled into a false sense of safety, and Ingrid wasn't sure if she should be grateful or terrified. The next day, Captain Mitchell approached Ingrid while she was working in the workshop again. "I heard you've been helping out around here," she said, her voice polite but firm. Ingrid glanced up, meeting her gaze. "I've noticed your work ethic." The captain paused for a moment, as if considering her words. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Ingrid didn't know how to respond. The captain's words seemed so ordinary, so benign, but there was an edge to them, an underlying tension that Ingrid couldn't shake. Was this a kindness, or was it a way to draw her in, to make her feel indebted? The unease continued to grow as Ingrid spent more time in the camp. She began to notice little details that seemed to contradict the perfect image the Americans were trying to project. There were always guards around, watching the prisoners with careful eyes. They didn't speak much, but their presence was constant, unyielding. Ingrid had been in enough camps to know that there was no such thing as true freedom in a prisoner's life. Every action, every word was calculated. The way the soldiers treated them with respect was part of the process, part of a carefully constructed facade to make them feel like they were more than just captives. It was during one of her shifts in the camp kitchen that Ingrid overheard another conversation between two soldiers. This time, it was not a simple exchange of pleasantries. They were discussing the prisoners in more detail, what they had learned about their backgrounds, what they had shared during conversations. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones, as though unaware that Ingrid could hear them. "They've got to be useful for something," one of them said, his voice low and deliberate. "We need information. They're not just here to cook and clean." Ingrid's stomach churned. There it was again, this subtle undercurrent of control, of manipulation. She couldn't shake the feeling that the camp was more of a test than a safe haven. The American soldiers were acting as though they were offering freedom, but in reality, they were just offering a different kind of prison. Ingrid wasn't sure what they wanted, but the more she observed, the more she realized that the kindness they showed was just another form of control. They weren't just trying to break her body, they were trying to break her spirit. They wanted her to believe that this was all she deserved, that this was the best she could have after everything that had happened. The feeling of being watched was never far from Ingrid's mind. Whether it was a guard standing nearby or another soldier passing through, there was always someone observing. She had learned to read people's faces, to detect the smallest sign of doubt or suspicion. But here, it was different. The soldiers didn't seem to be looking for anything overt. They were watching, yes, but it was a passive, almost detached observation. Ingrid couldn't decide if it was more unsettling to have someone watch her quietly or to have them actively engage with her, as if they were waiting for her to reveal something she didn't even know about herself. That evening, as the sun set over the camp, Ingrid sat outside her barracks, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and doubt. She couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this camp than she realized. Maybe it was just a matter of time before the truth revealed itself, before the kindness gave way to something darker. She had seen it all before, in different camps, under different flags. Hope was always fleeting, always followed by disappointment. But as the stars began to fill the night sky, Ingrid realized that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't completely sure of what would happen next. And that uncertainty, more than anything else, made her both fearful and hopeful. By the end of the second week at Camp Blackwater, Ingrid had begun to feel a strange mix of relief and unease. The days were predictable, with each following a rhythm that seemed almost too normal. The work, while tiring, was not as grueling as she had feared. The meals, although simple, were steady and filling. The constant, oppressive noise of war had been replaced by a silence that was both peaceful and disconcerting. Ingrid had almost begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was a safe place. But the more she tried to convince herself of this, the more her suspicion grew. It was too easy, too controlled. The American soldiers, who had once seemed so distant and formal, had begun to show their humanity in small ways. They smiled occasionally, nodded at the prisoners, and even exchanged a few words when the mood was light. Ingrid couldn't deny that there was something disarming about their manner, but she had learned long ago to never trust appearances. These small gestures, she believed, were part of a larger plan to make the prisoners feel comfortable. If they could make them feel at ease, they could extract more information, more compliance, without ever raising a hand in violence. The kindness was not real. It was strategic. One day, Ingrid was called to the infirmary to help with a minor injury that one of the prisoners had sustained while working in the garden. The American doctor, Dr. Patterson, had noticed Ingrid's medical background and had begun to rely on her assistance. Ingrid approached the small clinic with mixed feelings. She was grateful for the opportunity to be useful, to feel like she still had a purpose, but there was also a nagging discomfort in the back of her mind. She didn't know if she could ever truly trust the people who had imprisoned her, even if they spoke kindly and treated her like a colleague. When she entered the clinic, Dr. Patterson greeted her with a smile, handing her a pair of gloves. "I'm glad you're here, Ingrid. This will be a simple bandage job," she said. Ingrid nodded, but the words felt hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Patterson was more than just a doctor. She was a part of the machine that kept them in line. Ingrid had spent too many years in hospitals, too many years under oppressive regimes, to believe that any act of kindness was without its ulterior motives. As Ingrid worked, stitching the small wound, she noticed how carefully Dr. Patterson observed her. The American doctor was meticulous in her examination, asking Ingrid how she had learned such precise techniques. Ingrid hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. She had been a field surgeon in the German army, but telling the Americans that could raise suspicions. Still, she had little choice. "I learned on the front lines," she said quietly, avoiding Dr. Patterson's gaze. The doctor nodded, but Ingrid noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a slight tightness in her expression. For a moment, Ingrid wondered if Dr. Patterson had heard something she wasn't supposed to. But the moment passed, and Dr. Patterson returned to her usual professional calm. Ingrid finished the bandage and stepped back, feeling a strange sense of pride in the simplicity of the task. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small spark of something like hope. Maybe the Americans weren't as cruel as she had been led to believe. But just as quickly, that hope was smothered by the reality of her situation. That evening, as Ingrid sat in the barracks, she couldn't stop thinking about the day's events. She had been so careful, so wary of letting herself believe in anything other than survival, but she had allowed herself a moment of comfort. She had been helping, she had been useful again, and that felt like a luxury. But as the hours passed and the camp fell into its usual routine, Ingrid knew that this could never be enough. She could never forget who she was or where she was. The Americans were not her friends. They were her captors, and they had their own agenda. The next day, Ingrid was summoned to the administration building. She was surprised to find herself face to face with Captain Mitchell, the woman who had greeted her and the others when they first arrived. Captain Mitchell was standing behind a desk, looking at Ingrid with a neutral expression. "I need to speak with you about your role here," the captain said, her voice steady but firm. "You've been doing good work, Ingrid. I've been hearing positive reports about your efforts in the workshop and the infirmary. I want you to know that we value your skills." Ingrid stood still, her heart pounding. She had expected some form of questioning, but not this. The captain's words seemed kind, even reassuring, but Ingrid had learned to read between the lines. "Thank you, Captain," Ingrid replied, keeping her voice even. "I'm just doing what I can to help." Captain Mitchell nodded, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I know you're doing your best. However, there's something I need to make clear. We have rules here, rules we expect everyone to follow. You're a prisoner of war, Ingrid, and I need to remind you of that. The work you're doing is appreciated, but it doesn't change the fact that you're here under our control. Don't forget that." Hit Ingrid like a slap. She had been fooling herself, thinking that the Americans might actually be different. But now, standing in front of Captain Mitchell, she realized that they were all the same. They were in control, and no matter how many times they treated her with kindness, they would always be the ones who decided her fate. Ingrid's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She nodded once, sharply, but said nothing. The conversation was over. As she left the building, Ingrid felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. The false calm that had settled over the camp was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. The Americans were not there to make them feel safe. They were there to control them. Ingrid's hope, which had flickered so briefly, now seemed like a distant memory. The reality of her situation had returned with full force. She was a prisoner, and nothing, not even the small comforts of camp life, could change that. That night, as Ingrid lay in her bunk, the sound of the guard's footsteps echoing in the distance, she felt the weight of her captivity more heavily than ever before. The small gestures of kindness, the warmth of the baths, the comfort of the beds, none of it mattered. She was still trapped, still at the mercy of those who held the power. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The days that followed Ingrid's meeting with Captain Mitchell felt longer than usual. The warmth that had briefly entered her heart upon receiving respect and kindness from the Americans now seemed like a distant illusion. Ingrid began to notice the subtle shifts in the camp's atmosphere, small changes that she had once overlooked. The guards who had once smiled faintly at the prisoners now kept their eyes cold and distant. The Americans, once so cordial, were growing more tense, their manner increasingly formal. Ingrid sensed that something was coming, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The calmness that had made her feel safe was starting to feel like a trap. One afternoon, a group of prisoners, including Ingrid, were gathered in the camp's main courtyard to perform manual labor, digging and sorting through rubble from a recent construction project. The air was thick with the weight of unsaid words, and Ingrid felt the tension mounting with each passing hour. As she worked, her thoughts drifted back to her family, to the life she had once had. She wondered if they were alive, if they had survived the war, if there was any chance she would ever see them again. But her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of boots approaching. Ingrid glanced up, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw a group of high-ranking officers walking toward them. They were led by Colonel Harrison, the man who had been a constant presence in the camp in recent days. Colonel Harrison's arrival had not gone unnoticed. The other prisoners began to shift uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. Ingrid could feel the unease in the air, the tension thickening with each step the officers took. There was no mistaking it now. Something had changed. Colonel Harrison, with his stern, calculating gaze, was no longer a passive observer. He was here for a reason, and Ingrid knew it wasn't good. As Colonel Harrison approached the group of prisoners, his gaze swept over them with cold efficiency. His eyes lingered briefly on Ingrid, but he said nothing to her. His focus seemed to be elsewhere, as if he were assessing their value or, perhaps, their potential for usefulness. The officers around him spoke in low, deliberate tones, and Ingrid couldn't help but overhear a few words. "Intelligence," one of the officers murmured. "We need something from them. They've been here too long without providing anything useful." The words sent a chill through Ingrid's spine. She had known this moment was coming, when the facade of kindness would crumble and the Americans would reveal their true intentions. After a few more moments of tense silence, Colonel Harrison spoke to the camp's captain, Mitchell. His voice was firm and cold. "Captain, I've given you ample time to prove that this approach is working, but we're not getting results. We need information, and we need it now." Captain Mitchell, who had once been so composed and gentle, now stood rigid, her face a mask of professional detachment. She nodded once, her expression unreadable. Ingrid couldn't help but wonder what this meant for the prisoners. If their usefulness had reached its limit, what would happen to them next? The shift in tone was unmistakable. The calm, polite routine they had grown accustomed to was being replaced with a colder, more calculated atmosphere. Ingrid could see it in the way the soldiers moved now, faster, more purposefully. The kindness had been a means to an end, a way to lower the prisoners' defenses before they tightened the noose. Ingrid's instincts screamed at her to be ready for what was coming next. She had seen enough of war to know that things were about to escalate. The moment of safety, the brief respite, was over. As the days wore on, the changes in the camp grew more pronounced. The food rations were cut, and the prisoners were forced to work longer hours. The guards were more watchful, more demanding. The small privileges they had once been granted were slowly withdrawn, and the atmosphere in the camp became oppressive. Ingrid felt the weight of each passing hour, each moment more suffocating than the last. She had been lulled into a false sense of security, but now the reality of her situation was sinking in once more. One evening, as Ingrid sat in her quarters, her thoughts swirling with confusion and dread, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Captain Mitchell standing there, her face tense. Without a word, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Ingrid could see that something was wrong, but she couldn't quite place it. The captain was no longer the friendly, warm woman who had first welcomed them into the camp. She was now a figure of authority, her every movement measured, her expression grim.
"I need to speak with you," Captain Mitchell said quietly, her voice low and urgent. "Things are changing here, Ingrid. Colonel Harrison has made it clear that we need to get results. They're going to start questioning the prisoners, and they'll use whatever means necessary." Ingrid's heart sank at the words. She had feared this moment, feared the inevitable shift in power that would turn them all back into mere tools, meant to serve the whims of their captors.
Captain Mitchell paused, as if weighing her next words. "I'm not in charge of what happens next," she continued, her voice tinged with regret. "But I want you to know that you've earned my respect. I'll do what I can to help you, but you have to understand, there are limits to what I can do in this situation." Ingrid nodded, her mind racing. She could see the conflict in Captain Mitchell's eyes, but it did little to comfort her. There were no more illusions to cling to. The calm, the kindness, had all been a facade. The war, it seemed, was still very much alive, and it would not let them go so easily. As the days grew darker, Ingrid began to realize just how precarious her position was. The Americans had given her a taste of safety, of normalcy, but it had been a fragile, fleeting thing. Now, with the arrival of Colonel Harrison's influence, the true nature of the camp was being revealed. They had never been safe. They had only been allowed to believe they were. And now, as the questioning began, Ingrid felt the familiar grip of fear tighten around her chest once more. She had been given hope only to have it ripped away. The cycle of cruelty and control was beginning again, and she was trapped in it, just as she had always feared.